the day, talking through specifically Illinois social equity. We had some light conversations about social equity in previous sessions, so now we're going to have a very targeted conversation about the history of social equity in the state of Illinois. Let's get to get our panelists in. So for our session today, we will be having Peter Contos, who's the Deputy Director at Cannabis Equity Illinois Coalition, as well as Dr. Angelyn Anderson, who is the Executive Vice President of Equity and Community Engagement for HT23 Growers. To kick it off, I'm sorry, let me spotlight you. Thank you. Good. All right. So I just want to let you all kick it off with some brief introductions of yourself. So I'll let Dr. Angelyn kick it off.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? I'm trying to make sure my AirPods are working well. All right, perfect. I'm Dr. Angelyn Anderson, and as Asia mentioned, I serve as the Executive Vice President of Equity and Community Engagement for HT23 Growers. We are 100% Black owned. We are based in Chicago Heights, Illinois, and we are really focused as being a community transformation organization. And so that is what our work is. That is what my work is as far as engaging the community. I have been in the cannabis industry since it became legal as rec in Illinois in 2020. And I have a background in education, higher education. So that is me in a nutshell.
Hello, everybody. Hope everyone's doing all right today. It's great to be here. Peter Contos, my name is Peter Contos. I'm the Deputy Director of the Cannabis Equity Illinois Coalition. The coalition is a nonprofit organization we founded in the lead up to legalization back in 2019. Founded by community members impacted by the war on drugs, really making sure we hold our lawmakers to their promises of equity, justice, and repair. Illinois, as we'll get to, is one of the states that really sought out to create real, meaningful investment. And, we've spent the last 5.5 years working to, towards those goals. So a little bit about me. I'm originally from the Detroit area. I moved to Chicago in 2014. And right as kind of the writing was on the wall that it was coming to Illinois in 2018, I was able to get involved with Students for Sensible Drug Policy to plug in eventually with who became the coalition and so many other amazing advocates back in 2018, 2019. And I'm really excited to talk more about our experiences today and how we'll move forward.
And I want to kick it off for those who really don't understand the history of Illinois social equity and kind of how it's been implemented in the state. Can you give some background on what that looks like? I'll throw that to Peter.
Sounds good. So a lot has, Illinois is really the first state to, as a whole, to address social equity and address the harms from the war on drugs. California, certain cities had talked about this, but never as a whole state. Colorado had hinted at it in places like Denver, but nobody really had a full state response in terms of when they legalized. And so Illinois back in 2018, 2019 was really the first where our lawmakers got out in front of this issue and said, hey, we want to legalize, and we wanted to legalize with the intention of repairing the harm from the war on drugs. It's obviously a lot that's a statement's huge. There's so much that repair that needs to be done. And just because we legalize adult use cannabis, there's so many comprehensive reforms that still have to be made. And so Illinois, we sought out, our lawmakers, really kind of set up a structure where there was kind of 3 pillars of social equity. One would be the actual social equity licensing program. So they, sought to actually get licenses into the hands of folks who were directly impacted by the war on drugs. 2 is the R3 program, which was really the first of its kind in a legalization program where 25% of Illinois cannabis tax revenue goes to this R3 program, which is designed to support communities impacted by the war on drugs. So it's focused on things like youth services, violence prevention, legal aid, and again, really targeting communities that have been divested in and impacted by the drug war. And the last item is around expungement. And so they included a piece around automatic expungement of very low-level standalone cases where they're clearing those records automatically at the state level. So, Illinois really rolled out with those kind of three pillars. There's obviously that legalization bill is, 600 plus pages. So there's a lot more to it, but those are kind of some of the high level kind of pillars that we kind of set up with, 5.5 years ago.
Thank you for that. And kind of as we talk about where it started, how has social equity evolved in Illinois, and what are some key moments that have shaped its current implementation? I'll let
Uh,
either one of you.
I think that as far as the evolution, how it's evolved, I think it's still going on, right? So we have these key three pillars that Peter is like spelled out for us, right? And condensed that whole bill. But I think the evolution is still going on. And so I think one of the key things that just this social equity piece has really brought is the shine. It's kind of put a spotlight on, we don't know what you don't know until you actually do the program. And so there have definitely needed to be some pivots, and I know that we'll talk about that a little bit later. But yeah, I just think that the evolution is still happening. And so for me, it's really challenging to say, well, we've gone from this to this, right? Because there have been so many kind of starts and stops when you look at the pieces of the social equity piece and component that the state has drawn up, that I don't know if we can fully realize what the evolution is until we kind of deal with some of these stop and starts that have occurred. So I don't know if that makes sense to you all.
That definitely makes sense. And if I can just add real quick, these stops and starts, we're talking about from, really from the beginning. We legalized, the bill was drafted and signed in the summer of 2019. And January 2020 is when, the flip got switched and people, adults could start to buy cannabis, and all of those, applications were due. And so we're talking about, since that time, so many lawsuits, so many court rulings, waiting for the court rulings, waiting for bills to be passed or for them to get passed and then not implemented. There's so many so many instances where it's you're hurry up and waiting. And that goes for myself as an advocate. I can speak definitely for Dr. Anderson. So many business owners, like, just all of a sudden complete uncertainty in terms of, like, is this program even legal? There was a time where they were debating the constitutionality of the whole thing, and we were worried it might get blown up, and it's a lot.
I want to dig more into those start and stops that kind of we've experienced over the course of the past about 4 or 5 years with our social equity program. Can you give like some examples? We all know 2021 was a very difficult year for applicants and for licensees, but can you give some background for those who may not really understand what that was and what that was like?
I'm going to defer to Pete to start on this one, because I have a few points that I want to kind of piggyback on what he brings up.
Sounds good. So first and foremost, the whole program really got stopped in, March 2020. COVID happened, the whole world shut down. Nobody was thinking about, what cannabis looked like. Everyone was focused on immediate health of our communities. And so there was a lot of, and we don't have time for it today, but there's a lot of so the state of Illinois, we took in all of these applications for dispensaries and grows and transportation for the social equity program, January 2020. All of those reports, or all those applications, were actively being graded during, as soon as, when the pandemic happened. And so that project had to stop entirely because the contract that, the organization KPMG, they had a rule where, nobody could travel anymore. And all of those reports were on paper. And so first and foremost, you see like the whole social equity projects or programs slowed down because they couldn't even grade the applications. I would encourage listeners to learn why Illinois set up that contract with KPMG in the first place. It was there's some very good reporting that Gronin did about it years ago. It talked about kind of the essentially that contract was signed in the middle of the night without any transparency, and so things like a no travel rule weren't even really something people thought about, and so that slowed the whole process down for months. Eventually, the applications were graded. And there was a there's a list of the first winners. I believe this is September of 2021 now. I might be messing up this timeline in my head, so I apologize if I mislead anybody. But it takes, a very long time for the applications to eventually get graded. The scores are released, and there was a whole lot of issues with kind of how that happened. One of the main issues is the way the state legalization law was interpreted was only perfect scores could win licenses. And so essentially, the application became, you had to score, was it 252 points out of 252 to win a license? You had to score a perfect application, which meant you had to have, a ton of different, community impact program, security plans, all that kind of stuff. But also, your board and your principal officers had to be incredibly diverse. You needed people with disabilities, you needed people who had been incarcerated. Specifically, you needed to have a veteran, and that's where this whole thing kind of blows up, is because nobody kind of thought that anybody would need a perfect score to win an application. You score 98 on a test, it's A plus. That's pretty darn good. Like, I think you're pretty qualified. Illinois did not do that. It was 100% was required, and so again, essentially the only people who won were veteran-led organizations. And this is not me taking a stand against veterans, but military veterans are not who this project was originally supposed to be, like the intended recipient. It's supposed to be folks who were impacted by the war on drugs, by mass incarceration, by systemic disinvestment. And there's a lot of veterans who are included in that. But this project essentially, or the program essentially became a veterans only system. And that is where kind of the first wave of lawsuits gets filed. So I'll stop there because this is also going years back. So if I smudge some details, I do apologize.
And I think that in addition to, like, as if that wasn't enough with the lawsuits, right? In addition to those lawsuits, you also had it to where people were just trying to figure out the process of, okay, I'm thinking about when we signed our commitment and saying, yes, we want the license when we received it. I think we were notified in July of 21. And I think the license was effective, I think, of August 1 of that year. But even stuff that's as simple as do you want the license? Yes, we want the license. And so you were supposed to sign a piece of paper saying, acknowledging that you received the information, that you wanted the license. But there was ambiguity even with how much were you supposed to pay for the license, right? Because the license fee was $40,000. But as social equity, the way that it was written, you were supposed to get, it was supposed to be 20,000 for you. But the way that the paperwork looked, you were like, do I send 40? Do I send 20? There was no clarity on that, right? And so looking at that, the lawsuits, also looking at, okay, now these people have accepted these licenses, but part of that acceptance of licenses and part of the application process, honestly, was letter of intent for locations. How can I get a letter of intent when I don't have money to put down for somebody to hold my space, right? And there, you have these properties. And then, of course, once you've gotten a license and you've signed a letter of intent saying, hey, I have a place that I can find that I think will be suitable, I don't even know how many people genuinely stayed in their original places because they then had to go someplace else because of zoning issues, right? And still trying to find those pieces. And then again, having the clock ticking on, you have to have your place by this particular date, this particular time, or you could potentially forfeit your license. I think the starts and stops that were there, the state definitely did not anticipate that. because they had to come back and do a lot of extensions. They had to give a lot of grace. They had to, think on their feet. And in some instances, them thinking on their feet caused a little more harm than it helped. Because again, you have people who are looking at it from this level, but not really conversing with the people that are actually here running into these obstacles, because what you're seeing up here and thinking is going to be an issue that's easily fixed is totally different than somebody that's actually on boots on ground trying to get a place, find a place, trying to determine how to navigate that, how to do it without funding. And let's talk about that. Funding is actually one of the biggest elephants in the room that everybody knows is an issue, but nobody seems to have the working solution. Even when we had the ability to get loans through the state, even that process was a hiccup because it was starts and stops with how that looked and what you needed to submit and whose credit needed to be evaluated, why is somebody's credit needing to be evaluated, how much has to be had in liquid capital. Like all of those different things were major obstacles. And I won't even say are major obstacles because they're still going. And each time we try to alleviate those, we run into something else. And so it needs to, I think people need to take a beat and kind of sit and say, okay, wait, what are all of these issues that are happening from the perspective of the licensee? And what is it that they have as suggestions on how to resolve it? Right? Because you still have, of all of those licenses that were awarded and all of the ones that are active, meaning that they continue to pay their renewal fee, which by the way, is not $20,000 each year. It is $40,000. It was only $20,000 that first year if you were a craft grow, like so. And of the other licenses, it was still 50% of what the actual was for that initial year. No one's really addressing that. And so you still have places that are not operational, but they're not making money, but they're still having to pay these fees to still be in good standing. So I think that that's another start and stop that has continuously plagued our program here in Illinois.
And just real quick to close on, I think on this question, while all of these starts and stops are happening, while all of these companies are, trying to figure out the next move, the multi-state operators who essentially helped write the legalization bill, they're making money hand over fist. They're the only game in town, the only legal game in town. And so January 1st 2020, the 55 medical operators, they were allowed to open up a second site. So they had there was 110 dispensaries who were running the show in 2020. Those stores have only continued to grow. They're obviously making money, but also brand familiarity, all of these things we talk about in terms of how to run a successful business. Social equity folks were just denied that entire time from accessing this program. And again, nobody could have predicted COVID. We wish things could have gone better. Of course, hindsight is 2020 on that. But just really want to stress like how quickly all of this happened. Again, the governor was elected November of 2018. By the end of May 2019, cannabis legalization was passed. The sports gambling bill was passed. The reproductive health bill was passed. The biggest capital budget in Illinois history. So there was a ton of stuff that got done in a very short period of time that, again, hindsight's 2020, but nobody was able to read these bills in full. Nobody was really able to understand the consequences of what was out here because they were just too busy trying to pass the bill. And so that is one of those unintended consequences of, Illinois. There were some good intentions put out there, but ultimately this was done so quickly. And, that's ultimately why we're in this position.
I really appreciate that historical context because I think we forget how quickly the political landscape can change everything. It was mentioned in our keynote how before we were recreationally legalized, we had Governor Rauner and very anti-cannabis, and how we switched to Pritzker and things escalated so quickly, and we kind of forget that gets left in our memories about how swift this process went. And you both really spoke to a lot of the challenges that applicants and licensees have faced. Do you have any strategies on how licensees and applicants can be successful in in overcoming these barriers that you mentioned?
Yeah, so there are a couple things. I'm trying to be on my better behavior. I think there are a couple of things that can be considered. First and foremost, we as with HT23 as an entity, we're always saying, what's our why? Like we are always going back to what our why is, right? And so as a result, I think that anybody who is in this industry and anyone who is a social equity applicant and a social equity licensee, continue to go back to your why, right? Because you're gonna have to slay these dragons over here when it comes to funding, and that's a you got to find people on your team that's gonna do that because everybody can't fight it, right? But while that is going on, you still can't sit here as a lame duck because your brand still needs to be out there. Because I'm just gonna be honest, every year that my team and I have to pay that $40,000 renewal fee, that's even more fire for me to make sure that our name is out there because we need to make some money because that $40,000 renewal fee, right? Also, the cost of what we're going to need to come out of in order to get our facility up to code for the state and for the industry. And so, in order for us to really have that identity and in order for us to really have that brand name recognition out there, we can't just be focused on getting the money. We have to be engaged in the community. And so, you can't wait until you get the money to start doing the work. You need to start doing the work now. And that work, it needs to be some, in some instances, it's free work. We went out and we planted trees with the community. And so we got to ride in the car with someone who lived in our community. We got to learn about them, learn about their history being in Chicago Heights, how they grew up there. And we made an impression on them to where they are comfortable reaching out and asking questions or, connecting with us. We do something once a month in Chicago Heights where it's called Sip and Share, where I go out and literally buy coffee, sitting in a local coffee store or Dunkin' Donuts in the community, and I buy coffee for an hour for community members that come in every month, once a month on a Saturday morning. And I don't want anything from you outside of you knowing who I am, right? I don't even talk cannabis with them unless they want to talk it. I buy them coffee. Going out and going to your local municipal meeting. So whether that is the monthly city council meeting, wherever you are, I know in Chicago Heights, our council meets twice a month. Also going and having conversations with organizations that may have the stigma surrounding cannabis, right? Having those conversations with them. So you can't just wait on the money to come. You have to be engaged in the community, whether you have the money there or not. As long as you have an active license, you are in business. You're just in business in a different way. So you have to be creative in how you engage the community and who you're talking to and what you're doing to get your name out there and having your face in front of it. We have a non-for-profit where we work in the community, and one of the things we're going to be doing is helping people understand the business side of cannabis. So often they hear about cutting and trimming and growing and, oh yeah, the dispensary. No, we don't have a dispensary. We actually grow, but there are other things you can do in the cannabis industry. So getting out there and educating the community, engaging with the community. You can't wait for your funding to come. You can't wait until your facility is built out. As long as you have a breath in your body and as long as you're paying that $40,000 renewal fee. As you all can see, I'm stuck on the $40,000 because I have some personal feelings about this. I feel some kind of way about it. But getting out there and finding creative ways to engage and to partner with the community is something that I think you need to do to really shift what this looks like in the social equity space.
And I can speak to that was phenomenal, and I can speak a little bit more to the advocacy side of things, because it is similar to everything Dr. Anderson said with running the business. Continuing to go back to your why. We're up against a 1,000-pound dragon over here. Like, this is not something small that we're up against. Like, there's a lot of money, there's a lot of corporate power, there's a lot of individuals who would like the status quo to continue in Illinois, and that is, corporations running the show, whether it's the cannabis companies, whether it's ComEd and People's Gas, like they're Illinois residents, we're being, sucked dry across the board by, really just like bad actors, bad faith actors. And so like really need folks to understand like what it is we're up against, and like please do not lose the faith. Like we need to continue to work at this. Change is not going to happen overnight. I would have loved for us to make more change over the last 5.5 years. But this, y'all, like it's a lot. And so one thing I will want to call out is just, find your people. Like we have a beautiful cannabis community here in Chicago, Chicagoland, across the state of Illinois. Your people are out there. You just got to find them. And like, that is what gives me hope. That's what gives, all of us motivation. And ultimately that gives us power. The more we're connected with each other, the more we can, really become familiar with each other, understand each other's struggles. Like we can really move forward collectively, and actually start to address some of the systemic change, barriers that are, that folks are up against. Again, whether it's cannabis, whether it's healthcare, whether it's the schools, like we need reform across the board. Like, so, again, finding your people is everything. And one thing I want to call out as an advocate, like, one thing Dr. Anderson said, like, you have to listen to the folks on the ground. We're not just going to Springfield like, hey, we think this is a good idea, you should pass this law. Like, no, we're talking to HT 393. We're talking to all of the social equity applicants and social equity business owners that are in our network, talking to the folks who don't have a license, talking to folks in the legacy industry who want to get a license, talking to folks in the legacy industry who don't want a license. Like, there's so many different stakeholders that we're talking to that we have to continue talking to, so we understand like what even makes sense. Because at this point, we're fighting for things like we got to waive all these fees. Like if I don't have an operational business, why am I paying the state of Illinois $40,000? Like make that make sense. And so, again, really like continuing to listen to folks on the ground. Because again, whether it's cannabis, whether it's any other issue area, like the folks going through it understand this issue the most, and that's where the solutions are going to come from. And so just continue to keep your, ears to the ground. And what I will call out, personally, is the Cannabis Equity Coalition. We do have policy meetings every other Monday, including tonight at 5:30. So if you are interested, attend some meetings. Dr. Anderson mentioned like your city council, like y'all, if you showed up to these meetings and you saw what goes down or what doesn't happen, because it's amazing how little work gets done, you'd be a lot more pissed off about the state of things. And like, it's really important that you see it for yourself. And the last thing I'll say as an advocate is like really encourage people, especially coming to Springfield, like once you see it for yourself like even just once, you will understand how this works. And you understand kind of why we keep beating our heads against this wall, because like this has to change. This system of, corporate lobbyists get to tell lawmakers what bills to pass and what not to pass. Like this does not work, and folks are really going through it, and the solutions are there. So I will get off my soapbox.
Stay on the soapbox, please. We'll need it. So I kind of want to go back to what you said before. You mentioned that Illinois was the first state to really implement a social equity program. And so since its initiation, other states have also rolled out versions of their social equity programming. What responsibility does the state of Illinois have to adapt and evolve as others look to it for guidance? And it's a two-part question. Additionally, what can we learn from the ways in which other states have developed their social equity programs as we continue to build out in Illinois?
Okay, so how do I put this? We made it halfway through the questions, and now I'm just kind of feeling a little spicy. What responsibility does Illinois have to adopt and evolve? I don't feel like they have a responsibility, because with responsibility comes accountability. And there have been some things that they needed to be accountable for that they have not been accountable for. And so I don't view it as they have a responsibility unless they want to also couple it with that accountability. And I don't see that happening with any consistency or with any care for the folks that are out here drowning. With that being said, I think that the state of Illinois absolutely can be used as an example of what it looks like to do something like that. And what it looks like when pieces of the puzzle, when things fall apart, right? so that the other states can use this as an example of here's what not to do, or here's what to adjust, right? And what's the interesting thing is, however the state goes, so goes the county, so goes our partners in MSOs. And I'm going to say partners because the reality is we can't compete with them. So we should, like, I was just having a conversation with someone 2 days ago who said, I applied for a license twice and I didn't get it. It's the MSOs. And I was like, well, yeah, you're never going to compete with the MSOs. So as long as you have that mentality of I need to compete with the MSOs, you're never going to be successful. Again, going back to your why and what your niche is. And so I think that the state of Illinois, they don't have a responsibility because no one's holding them accountable. Because if they had accountability, then they would be responsible to the people that are sitting here screaming that they're drowning. And I'm going to hand it over to Pete before I say anything else.
That was spot on. I'm gonna get with responsibility comes accountability tattooed on my forehead, so our lawmakers understand what this really means. Because that you put, like, that was perfect. Because our lawmakers do not feel any need to be accountable to this program. As somebody who works in Springfield, it would be a lot better if people just acknowledged, hey, this has not gone the way we wanted it to go, and now we have to take a long look and evaluate how we move forward. That conversation, frankly, has not happened in full. There has been starts and stops as our theme today, but nothing has gone to the length it needs to go to. And so we talk about this, we just talked about the business owners. I will speak to the R3 program. Again, that's the program that's reinvesting money into communities most impacted. Our coalition is a grantee. We're part of an amazing collaboration with Illinois Equity Staffing, Spring of Living Waters, and a lot of other phenomenal Defy Ventures and a lot of great, amazing people. But the state doesn't pay us on time. And so the state is essentially, for the last couple of years, said, hey, do 6 months of it's a 12-week reentry program where it's a comprehensive, holistic, folks are getting services up front. They're getting, all types of education and training. But the state's just like, you guys can figure that out we'll pay you eventually. And so we talk about like how the state has, ultimately set people up to fail. Like there are layers to this. And let's just be very clear. It doesn't, from the business side to the R3 program to the expungement side, nobody has had like a really honest reflection. Everybody can say this is bad, but really the feeling in Springfield is that nobody wants to touch it. Nobody wants to touch it with a 10-foot pole, because everyone kind of is worried about looking like the person who screwed it all up. And so, kind of what I would close with is like, there's way too much pride on the line for some of these lawmakers. There's a lot of folks who are more worried about their personal feelings than they are about like the outcome of the policies they pass. And that is really unfortunate. And, ultimately as a state, we need to move forward without lawmakers like that altogether. And as a cannabis movement, and a drug policy reform movement and a prison policy movement, we cannot like stand for folks who are just going to be like, well, it didn't go the way we wanted to, so let's just let it continue. Like, that's frankly, I have a lot of, it's unfortunate is what the word I'll use. Yeah.
I think this is the perfect segue into the next question. And you've talked about how ego and pride have kind of played a role in a lack of changing our policies when you're really fixing the issues. What changes would you like to see if you had a magic wand and can really fix it? And I know this is probably the longest list, but we have a lot of time, so please take it.
I'm happy to share some of the bills, or Dr. Anderson, if you want to jump in first, please. All right, well, I will start with what's already on our wish list that we have taken to Springfield for the last 2.5 years now. And so, and I can make sure I drop these links into the chat so that everyone is able to access these. So there's a long list of things. We do not have time to get to all of them today. But first is our cannabis omnibus package, which is HB 2911. And this is basically like, this is the catch-up bill. So again, we haven't passed a lot of laws around cannabis since we legalized. This bill would try and move this program forward by, allowing the craft growers to finally expand their square footage, providing operational deadlines for dispensaries so they actually know like when their deadlines are. Some rules around anti-monopoly, behavior. So if we have companies who are found to be operating as a monopoly or trying to operate as a monopoly, we should be able to hold them accountable. And there's a lot more, and a drastic expansion of the medical cannabis program is really like the central part of that bill. Again, don't have time to talk about all the details, but that's kind of item number one, because again, we have so much catch up to do. Like, we need something that we can get through the door now, that gets us a little bit closer to where we ultimately want to get to. And then a couple more cannabis specific things. One is HB 1499, sorry. And that is specifically our social consumption bill. We want to make social consumption lounges and clubs, a reality in Illinois. No state has really figured out what they look like. And so we have patched together kind of some rules and legislation from other states that say, hey, these are the security rules. These are the ventilation rules. We're not trying to just, let people smoke in a smoky room. We know what secondhand smoke does to people, even if it's cannabis. So we want to really create social consumption lounges, again, significantly lower barrier to entry than some of these other cannabis businesses. But also it's a harm reduction tool. Right now you can really only consume if you're a homeowner, which is not a lot of people. And so we really, really have to figure out a way for people to go somewhere that's safe and secure for them to smoke, that's not going to get them evicted, that's not going to get them criminalized on the street, or anything like that. And then the last item I'll share for now is Senate Bill 125. And people might have heard about this issue recently. The Illinois State Supreme Court has ruled, around, they've been discussing the issue of, can the cops pull you over if they, think you smell like weed? We have been working on legislation to get this cleaned up for years now. Our legislation, Senate Bill 125, was kind of put on the back burner until the state Supreme Court ruled on the issue. The court did finally rule in September, and it's mostly good. Like, it's rules that the smell of burnt cannabis can't be used as probable cause, which that's what we've been fighting for this whole time. There are some questions, some lawyers have brought to us, like, hey, this is actually unclear still. The law still requires people to, for instance, carry their weed in an odor-proof container. So there's some things that still need to be sorted out. And so we hope to just clarify that. And our goal is, again, make sure nobody can be criminalized for, very arbitrary reasons that law enforcement have used for decades now, and have not shown that this is actually about public safety. It's much more of a, I can criminalize this person when I want. And so those are the kind of three major bills. There's so much more, obviously, we can talk about. And again, I'll put the link into the chat for our policy working group, because again, really encourage people to join that call and just talk about what else needs to get done, because there's so much more.
Okay, I'm gonna give like three things, and then yeah. So I think one of the first things, again, funding. Like, while these grants are amazing, it's not enough, right? If you have a facility where you need 10 million to do the whole facility, and you break it into phases, and you're trying to maintain your equity as a social equity licensee, that's going to get hard. Funding, banking. You can't have, if you get money, you don't have anywhere to put it there that you're not getting harmed at. One of the things that I would like to see, and I know that this is like really, this is a pie in the sky kind of dream, is usury fees against organizations, whether they're banks, whether they are other companies, because we call the cannabis tax is real. What people are getting taxed to put money in the bank, how much the monthly maintenance fees are to keep money in a bank that is cannabis friendly. I really feel like there should be some type of legislation relating to usury fees, because they are beasting these organizations. And if you are a social equity licensee, you already don't have the money. And then the little bit of money that you may have is being eaten up with a $3,000 a month or a $5,000 a month administrative fee to just verify that you're not laundering money. So funding, looking at expansion. allowing, again, these smaller entities like Craft Grow, HT23 is a craft grower, give us our 14,000 square feet. We're still not competing with the MSOs. The MSOs have what, 120,000, some of them have 200,000 square feet. So like, I'm not even painting that as the MSO being the bad guy. Like the legislation is setting it up to where it's really turning us against one another in this industry. And then the last thing, I'm just going to drop it and then I'm not going to say anything else. Being sure that we're doing regulation across the board, because here we are as responsible cannabis entities, maintaining compliance with the state. But I walked into a gas station last weekend and you had Delta 8 products on the shelves that looked like weed, and they were selling it freely and openly on the shelves. But I can't do that. I got to sell it to a dispensary. I have to have it packaged a certain way. I can't have my product in cookie jars on a shelf in a local gas station on 119th and Halsted, because that's not, that would be illegal. So going ahead and making sure that there is consistency with regulation, with those types of things, we have to go through testing. We have to do all of these things. We have to have stuff locked up a certain way. Yet you have other parts of this that are latching on to or leeching on to the industry that are not having to deal with any type of compliance. So I'm going to leave that there. Those are the three things that I'm choosing to choose violence for on today. Tomorrow, it may be another list of three. Stay tuned.
Thank you. No, I think that that's really, and we just finished our hemp versus cannabis conversation where, like, prior to this session, where I asked the question, what advice do you give to somebody who finds cannabis in these various places, quote unquote cannabis, but they don't know the difference. And the biggest response from Rebecca, the panelist, was if you can find it at a gas station, if you can find it at a corner store, it is not cannabis, and just know that. And unfortunately, it's not being marketed properly. Um, but moving on to the next question, with the upcoming election, with the concept of descheduling, being a part of the conversation, what changes could we anticipate in the industry, and how could they impact social equity business owners, licensees, or potential applicants?
Okay, so I lied when I said I was done choosing violence. So I'm gonna choose violence one more time, okay? And that is, I just really feel like whatever changes happen in these elections are going to be performative, because we're not getting to the root of the issue, right? So say you get rid of 280E, which is a tax thing that's eating us up too, right? You get rid of that, but if you haven't addressed the banking issue and you haven't addressed usury fees, you're still impacting these us as a social equity licensees, right? And no matter what changes happen, those changes are always going to be in favor of the system, and the system is going to work the way that it is designed to work, which is to be exclusionary. So it's up to the states and the local municipalities to say enough and create this type of legislation and rules and opportunities that aren't being created, right? And so I just really think it's going to be the changes, great, awesome. But I just feel like they're going to be performative because nobody is really still addressing the foundational dysfunction that exists in this space.
Spot on yet again. And I think just to echo everything that's been said, one of my notes is on here is it's pandering. And I think if this question was asked like this time a year ago, I probably would have responded differently. When Vice President Harris was Senator Harris, she was the chief sponsor of the Marijuana Justice Act in the Senate, which is like not a small thing, especially given her background as a prosecutor. And so like I wish I could be like, oh, look at that, like she did this. But my real genuine fear comes that now that the White House announced they want to reschedule and not deschedule, they also updated the policy platform for the Harrison Walz campaign to say they support rescheduling, which is just like frankly like a non-starter for us. Everything Dr. Anderson said, like this is not going to make Schedule 3 does not make cannabis more accessible. It does not move expungement or decarceration forward. It doesn't move, in our opinion, frankly, like the two biggest issues that our members see are it doesn't address anything around the gun issue, gun possession and cannabis, because that is still a hugely important issue that doesn't get talked about enough, as well as immigration. People who are not permanent residents of the United States can still be deported just for going into a dispensary. And so these kind of things where it's like, hey, it just feels like it's very surface level. And as people who spend all of our time under the surface, like looking through the details, filing through the information, and like really trying to understand what it all means, like we're just not convinced that this is something that's real. One thing I would call out is just like, and this is very neutral, is like for folks to follow along. There's a ballot initiative in Florida that's on the ballot next month, where Florida is looking at legalizing cannabis. And they're faced with like a really they're between a rock and a hard place, because if they vote yes and legalize weed, the way that bill is written is that like only a handful of companies would be able to run the whole industry, similar to Illinois, but like more extreme. And there wouldn't be any like expungement or anything like that. But at the opposite is, you're saying weed shouldn't be legal. And so, I know the former president has weighed in on that issue, like around that amendment. But I think that's just like a really interesting debate for everyone to follow along, just to see like we are really on this issue specifically, like this is not a great selection of choices. That's what I'll close with. Actually, what I will close with is I'm gonna get back on my personal soapbox. If you live in the city of Chicago, this is the first time there will ever be an elected school board. And so I know that's probably not the question you were asking at all, but like that's a huge thing. We talk about like how to get involved and like how to like really be in the know of things. That's a huge deal. And like really encourage people to get involved and like be aware of the school board election. Because as an organization who's working to like update the curriculum so that we move on from just say no, we move on from these really harmful education policies, and we move towards things like evidence-based harm reduction education that actually sets young people up to make more informed, better decisions. Like these are the kind of elections we need people to be aware of as well. So really encourage people to get plugged in.
Circle back on two things you mentioned. You mentioned gun possession and cannabis, and you mentioned immigration. I do want to talk about that a little bit more, because I'm sure a lot of people don't necessarily understand the nuances of that, or there's a lot of fear mongering surrounding cannabis, gun possession, and cannabis and immigration. Can you kind of expand what that looks like right now?
Yes. So what's happening right now is, especially I live in Chicago, so the context is Chicago and Chicagoland for us. So what's happening now is, because cannabis is a Schedule I, controlled substance at the federal level, cannabis is as bad as heroin. It's the worst thing ever. There's no medical uses and stuff like that. And so if somebody wants to get a gun, legally in Illinois, you have to fill out a form. And on that form, it says, do you knowingly use controlled substances? Cannabis is a controlled substance. And so you cannot legally have a gun and weed on you. And so even if you have a medical card, and even if you want to get a gun card, like you cannot legally have both. There's a lot of like legal issues about that we don't have time for, but like what's happening, like the consequence of that is people, I wish we could take all the guns, zap them out of the world immediately and probably be a better place, but like that's not the reality. And so people, carry guns for their, for their personal safety. And unfortunately, people are being stopped in the car or stopped on the street, and they're found to have both guns and weed on them. And in Cook County, what's really really harmful is that these people are being charged with unlawful use of a firearm, which on paper sounds like, oh my God, you shot up a school. In reality, you got pulled over, you had a legally registered firearm, and you had weed. Like that, it's not telling the whole story. And so those individuals, for the most part, have been going towards grand juries in the last couple of years, which is really problematic because they're being prosecuted at rates that are like almost guaranteed to find them guilty. And so what we're really getting at here is like, um, that is not like, public safety is so much more than just like, well, you had gun and weed on you, like we got to stop you. Like there's so much more to this that actually keeps people safe. And so that legal issue like still has to be addressed. And then on the immigration side, like one thing that I think is really unique about the coalition and the work we do was when we first started, there was a long debate over if this is going to be like a multiracial group, multi-ethnic group, because there was a lot of debate, like, well, our group was targeted the most, and one group saying we're targeted the most, and it's like, no, we all have to connect these struggles. So Black people on the South Side of Chicago, um, immigrants from Mexico, poor white people who have been impacted by the opioid crisis. This is all a shared experience. This is all like the government really trying to make sure people can't live freely and safely and healthy. And like we have to work together to ultimately uproot these issues. And so, immigration, I think a lot of folks are caught off guard. Like, why are you guys even talking about immigration? It's like, this is very much in line with what we do. The United States used the war on drugs to invade countries all over the planet and every continent. And like, we can't remove, our experience here in Chicago from those experiences outside of the country. And so, a long way of saying, like, we have to continue to have these conversations. We have to understand the intersections that all of these things have, because all these issues are connected. And again, our whole mission is having a people-led movement for positive change. And the more we can kind of be aware of these issues, these intersections, we can achieve more larger change. So yeah.
And then like one final thing for me, I think it's my final thing. We talk about how this conference has talked about like the benefits of cannabis and its related compounds and components, right? And how the federal government still has it scheduled with heroin and LSD. If cannabis is such a bad thing, then why did the federal government have a patent registered on cannabinoids? I think it's like I'll drop the patent in the chat. But to me, that speaks volumes without them saying out loud, like the direction that this really goes, like the hand that they're playing when it comes to cannabis, and whether it's THC, whether it's, if it's CBD, all of the things. If you'll notice, and going and looking at even research that's done outside of the US, who these researchers are miles ahead of us when it comes to using cannabis and related extraction methods to deal with dementia and other related health issues that people face. The federal government literally had a patent up until recently, had a patent on cannabinoids and their use in specific medical situations. So I say all that to say that, don't be distracted by the conversations that are on a continuous loop, right? It's the same game. They're using the same plays. Like, we really don't need to be mad about it because we already know what they're going to do and what they're going to say. So it's so important that as advocates and proponents and change makers, that we don't get caught up in that smoke and screen kind of deal that's happening over here. Yes, the funding is important. Yes, the all of the other things that they've listed as, being super important as to why cannabis cannot be taken off of the list of being something that's illegal. Those are great things that we need to talk about. However, don't let that continue to be the distraction from the work that needs to be done to advance cannabis and its uses in our communities.
And just to close on that, just because that was so great, is like really encourage everybody to like plug in and really like understand history, understand these intersections, because this is all like everything that's happening today is a repeat of what's happened in the past. And the more we understand about the past, the more prepared we can be for the future. And something that Dr. Anderson mentioned, like the government, they know what this is. They patented things. They're invested in these technologies. I've dropped a link into the chat for the Schaefer Commission. This was something that President Nixon had commissioned himself. Like, what do we do about weed? That's the question they answered. And it was a bipartisan task force, and they figured out, hey, this is actually not that serious. Like, we don't need to be, putting people in prison for this. Ultimately, that report gets thrown under the rug, and the expansion of the war on drugs happens, and the war on Black, brown, and poor white people continues to this day. And so please understand that like history is just going to continue to repeat itself. But the more informed we can be, the more prepared we'll be. And we're all gonna be in this together, y'all. There's no no stepping on top of each other to get further. Like, this is all like we're all gonna get to where we need to get to, or none of us are.
And if you want to learn a little bit more about history in a way that's kind of little less intimidating, I'm dropping a link to a book by, I believe it's Box Brown, and it's like the cannabis, the illegalization of cannabis in America. And it reads like a comic strip, but it's really deep because it tells you like how it was okay, how's history, and then how we got to where, somewhat of where we got to today.
Love that. And so if you haven't been checking the chat, please click these links because they're all very insightful and helpful. We have about 5 minutes left, so I want to give you both an opportunity to talk about your companies, talk about your organizations, the work you do very quickly to our audience, and give any last closing remarks. I'll start with Dr. Anderson.
And I started off in the beginning, so go ahead, Pete.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, so the Cannabis Equity Coalition. So again, we're a nonprofit organization. We do a lot of different things. So we do direct services, direct reentry services. Again, making sure folks coming home from incarceration have everything they need, from holistic services to actual like hands-on record clearing, technology literacy, and a whole lot more. We do a lot of education, so a lot of know your rights, like making sure people understand weed is legal, but unless you're 21 and a homeowner, there's still a lot of ways you can get in trouble. So, if you're ever interested in hosting like a workshop, you have a community group, you're like, hey, I want to do something like that, definitely reach out to us. We do a lot of political education as well, making sure people understand, again, using the war on drugs as like the lens, like how does the political system work? How does our government actually function? Like how does power get wielded? Because, the more we understand about how the system works, the more, again, we can actually fight it and get some real change made. And like I said, I did not mention this earlier, but everything that I mentioned in terms of the program, services, and education, we also have an awesome youth program. So if you know a group of young people or you work with young folks and you're like, hey, I want them to do Know Your Rights, I want them to do political education, we have a whole youth team that will go out and show up in your community to lead that kind of programming. So yeah, we have a lot going on, but please plug in with us if you have questions about anything cannabis. We are here to be a resource across the board. So I'll make sure that I put like our social media and everything like that into the chat. Yeah, grateful for the platform and continuing to give us space. Thank you.
HT23 Growers is one of the first craft grow licensees in the state of Illinois. We also are one of the few 100% Black owned licensees when it comes to craft grow. We are based in Chicago Heights, where we have a 60,000 square foot facility that we are currently doing a capital raise to build out so that we can provide jobs and opportunities in the Chicago Heights area. And our gummy brand, Savor, will be in the Illinois market, I believe, by the end of this month or early November. So please, please, please find us in your local dispensaries. If you do not see us in your dispensary, then ask for us. And it is Savor, spelled Savor. We took a French approach to it. So check us out. And we are excited to be in the game. We're excited to be in the industry, and we're excited to continue to do work to transform the community that we are serving.